My father laughed. "You're not on the list at the White House." Every officer snapped to attention. She almost dropped her clipboard. The young hostess at the White House reception desk had been doing her job all morning with practiced calm, scanning invitations, directing guests, managing the quiet, controlled energy of an event that carried the full weight of the nation behind it. But when she scanned my credentials and looked at her screen, her composure cracked. She turned, found the Admiral with her eyes, cleared her throat. "Sir," her voice dropped to something close to a whisper, "she's here." The Admiral didn't hesitate. He turned from the conversation he was having with two senior officials, and he walked, not strolled, walked with clear intention, directly toward me. My father was standing 2 feet to my left. He had been smiling seconds earlier. That familiar smile I'd known my whole life, a little too comfortable, a little too certain. He'd pulled out his gold-trimmed VIP invitation for the third time since we'd arrived at the grounds, holding it like a winning hand at a card table. "You weren't even supposed to be here," he had murmured to me just moments before. Not cruelly. That was the thing about my father, he was rarely cruel in the obvious way. He was just matter-of-fact about my irrelevance, like he was stating the weather. Now, watching the Admiral cover the distance between us, I saw my father's expression shift in real time. Confusion replacing confidence. Questions replacing certainty. The Admiral stopped directly in front of me. Not my father's me. Behind him, 3 military officers who had been standing at ease quietly straightened their posture. "Commander Alexandra Reeves." The Admiral extended his hand and shook mine with the kind of warmth reserved for people you genuinely respect. "We've been looking forward to having you here today. It's truly an honor." The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. To me, it felt like 30 years. Because moments like this one don't begin at places like the White House. They begin in living rooms nobody photographs, in kitchens where the wrong child waits for praise that never comes, in bedrooms where a little girl lies awake at night wondering what she'd have to do to finally matter. In my case, it began in a small town tucked into the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia, a town with one traffic light, a single pharmacy, and a hardware store that doubled as a community gathering place on Saturday mornings. A town where everyone knew your name and your business and your father's opinion of you before you could form your own. My name is Alexandra Reeves, Alex to most people, 39 years old, and for a very long time I was the ghost who lived inside my own family. My father, George Reeves, was not a monster. I want to be precise about that because the story of a monster would be simpler and easier to leave behind. He worked hard, he paid bills, he showed up every single day. He coached Little League for 8 years. He was the kind of man neighbors described as solid. The word solid covers a lot of quiet damage. When my younger brother Daniel arrived, I was 5, something fundamental realigned in our household, not maliciously, not even consciously, I think. But children feel the gravity of a family shift the way a plant feels when the light source moves. You turn toward what nourishes you, you wither in what doesn't. My father turned toward Daniel, like a sunflower finding its sun. I was 7 when I first truly understood this. I had spent a week working on a science project about the water cycle. I drew the diagrams by hand, labeled every stage, colored the clouds carefully with the right shades of gray and white. My teacher gave me the highest mark in the class and wrote "exceptional work" across the top in red pen. I ran home holding that paper like a torch. My father was in the garage, helping Daniel fix a flat tire on his bicycle. "Dad, look," I held the paper out. He glanced at it for the duration of a breath. "Good girl." Then, "Daniel, hold that steady." I stood at the garage door for another minute, paper still extended, waiting. Nothing else came. I walked to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. I looked at those 2 words, "exceptional work," written in red, and I tried to understand why they suddenly felt hollow. Children always blame themselves. They don't know yet that some empty spaces belong to other people. The living room wall in our house told the family's story better than any photograph album. Daniel's basketball trophies lined the shelves. His team photos covered every available surface. His newspaper clippings, local sports coverage, Nothing major, but displayed as if they were front-page national news, were framed and hung at eye level. There was not a single certificate, ribbon, or photograph of me anywhere in that room. When relatives visited, my father would walk them through Danny L's achievements like a museum docent, future athlete, natural leader. Boys got something special. Meanwhile, I could be sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, and the conversation would simply arc around me the way water moves around a stone, not noticing it, just flowing past. I started working when I was 14. By 15, I had a weekend job at the local pharmacy stocking shelves. By 16, I was buying my own school supplies and saving for college with a discipline my father never knew about, because he never asked. The only person who asked was my mother. My mother, Carolyn Reeves, was not a loud woman. She didn't argue or push or demand. She had a different kind of strength, the quiet, structural kind. The kind that holds everything together without anyone noticing until it's gone. She noticed everything. When I was 12, after an evening where my father had spent the entire drive home from Daniel's basketball game, reliving every play while I sat invisible in the back seat, I went to my room and stared at the wall. My mother knocked. She always knocked. "Can I sit with you?" She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't offer solutions. She sat beside me on the bed and let the silence breathe for a while, and somehow in that silence I felt more seen than I had all day. "He doesn't even know I exist," I finally said. She was quiet for a long moment. "He knows," she said carefully. "He just doesn't know how to show it the right way. Some people are carrying very old ideas, Alex, old ideas about what matters and who gets to matter. That's not fair." "No," she agreed simply, "it isn't." She took my hand then, and she said something I have never once forgotten in all the years since. "The people who don't see you clearly don't get to determine what you're worth. Only you get to do that." I looked at her. "And I see you," she said. "I see exactly who you are, and one day the rest of the world will too." At 12, I half believed her, the way you half believe something you desperately want to be true. Later, I would understand that she wasn't offering me comfort. She was telling me a fact. My mother got sick when I was 15. It began quietly, the way most devastating things do, a fatigue that didn't lift, an appointment that led to more appointments, words in a doctor's office that rearranged the furniture of our lives. Over the 2 years that followed, I watched the most capable person I knew become diminished by something she couldn't fight through sheer will. I watched her body betray her patience. I sat with her in hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and overhead lights, holding her hand while monitors beeped their indifferent rhythms. 3 months before my high school graduation, she died. I was 17. My father went quiet in a way I'd never seen him be quiet. Daniel threw himself into sports with a desperation that made sense only later. He was grieving in the only language he knew. The house became a place where grief walked the hallways, and nobody talked about it directly. The morning after the funeral, I went looking for something to hold on to. I found it in the cedar chest at the foot of my mother's bed, a sealed envelope with my name written in her handwriting. The paper inside smelled faintly of the lavender she kept in her dresser drawers. The letter wasn't long, but one sentence lived in me for the next 22 years. "Don't you ever let someone else's ceiling become your floor." I read it standing by the window in her room, sun coming through the curtains, the house so quiet it hummed. Then I folded it carefully, put it in my pocket, and started planning. My high school graduation was a complicated event. I walked across the stage and received my diploma in a gym packed with families. Around me, girls shrieked when their names were called, parents leaped to their feet, flashes popped. I shook the principal's hand and smiled for a photograph. My father clapped, politely. Afterward, he spent most of the evening talking about Daniel's upcoming athletic camp. I applied for 16 scholarships that summer. At the kitchen table, late at night, after my waitressing shifts, while my father watched television in the other room, I wrote essays about adversity and goals and the future I intended to build. My hand cramped. I revised until the words stopped feeling like mine, and then revised again until they did. 11 of those applications came back with acceptance letters. "That's probably your only real option," my father said when he saw the scholarship envelopes piling up on the counter. Not mockingly, just as a statement of fact, the way he would comment on the weather. Matter of fact about my constraints, as he had always been matter of fact about my existence. I remember sitting with those letters after he left the room. I thought about my mother's words. Then I gathered the papers, organized them into a folder, and chose the best offer. College was not easy. It was not meant to be. I waitressed on weekends and tutored underclassmen during the week. I stretched grocery money into meals that barely counted as cooking. I studied in the library because my apartment was too cold to concentrate in the winters. I slept less than my body wanted and worked more than my schedule allowed. And I discovered something in those years that I don't think I could have learned any other way. Resilience doesn't develop in comfort. It develops in the sustained act of continuing when continuing is the hardest option available. I watched classmates who had every resource struggle with motivation. I watched students who had been told their whole lives they were exceptional fall apart when a professor disagreed. I watched people who had always been chosen crumble when they weren't chosen. I had never needed to be chosen. I had learned to choose myself. That changed everything. My junior year, I attended a campus presentation by a Navy officer recruiter, not because I had planned to, but because I was studying in the building where it was held and walked past an open door. I stood in the back and listened. Afterward, she asked if anyone had questions. I raised my hand and asked what the Navy looked for in an officer candidate. She looked at me directly and said, "People who know who they are before we tell them." I sat with that answer for 3 months. Then I walked into a recruiting office and asked to know more. The morning I took my oath, my father called that evening. "Be careful," he said. That was the whole conversation. I sat in my apartment afterward, holding the small Navy insignia they'd given us, and I thought about my mother. Not in grief exactly, in something quieter, in the wish that she could see what the next chapter might look like. Training was a revelation. The Navy does not care where you came from. It does not care about your family's opinion of you. It does not bend its standards to meet your history or lower its expectations because of your past. It measures you against itself, and it measures everyone the same way. I had been training for that environment my entire life, without knowing it. Not because my father's neglect had made me stronger. I want to be careful not to frame pain as a gift, but because of my mother's love and my own stubbornness, and the habit of continuing I had built in all those years when continuing was the only choice I allowed myself. Some people work hard when someone believes in them. I had learned to work hard regardless. The Navy responded to that, not immediately, not with fanfare, but steadily the way water carves stone, not through force but through persistence. Early in my service, I encountered resistance that had nothing to do with my qualifications. I was a young woman in spaces still adjusting to young women. Some people expressed doubt without words, through assignments withheld, through meetings where my input was repeated by someone else and acknowledged only then, through the small accumulated weight of being underestimated. I made a decision that shaped everything that came after. I stopped trying to argue my way into credibility. Arguments require someone willing to listen. Instead, I became undeniable. When others rested, I studied. When others complained, I prepared. When others doubted, I worked. Slowly, the calculus changed. The people who had underestimated me began asking for my input. The supervisors who had barely noticed me began tracking my progress. The opportunities began arriving. My first promotion felt like something holy, not because of the rank, because every late night, every cold apartment, every scholarship essay, every shift, every moment of being overlooked and choosing to continue anyway, all of it had led here and been made worth something. I called my father to share the news. There was a pause on the line. "That's nice," he said. The exact same words he'd used about the science project when I was 7. I almost laughed. The years that followed were full. Deployments, leadership assignments, cross-country moves, colleagues who became lifelong friends, mentors who saw something in me worth developing, missions that reminded me why service matters. One assignment in particular altered the course of everything, though I didn't understand that until years later. Our unit became involved in a large-scale humanitarian response operation following a natural disaster that had destroyed entire communities in a coastal region. The need was enormous, and the timeline was impossible. For 3 weeks, we operated on minimal sleep, solving problems that didn't have established protocols. I watched service members, young men and women, many of them barely past 20, carry elderly residents through debris. I watched them hold frightened children. I watched them look at an impossible situation and ask not can we, but what do we do first? I think about those 3 weeks often, not because of what we accomplished, though we accomplished real things that mattered to real people, but because of what I understood about leadership during that time. Leadership is not authority. Authority is just position. Leadership is the decision to take responsibility for the people around you, not because you have to, but because you understand that their well-being and yours are connected. Someone, without my knowledge, documented that mission and included it in a nomination package. Years later, I would find out that it was one of the central citations in an official national recognition. At the time, I was simply doing my job. The envelope arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. I was sorting mail in the kitchen after a long day, and I nearly set it aside without opening it. The return address was a Washington office. I assumed it was administrative correspondence. I made coffee, I sat down, I opened it. I read it once, then twice, then a third time, pressing the paper flat against the table as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more comprehensible. It was an official invitation, a national recognition ceremony honoring distinguished military leadership and public service. The location, the White House. For a long time, I simply sat in the kitchen with the letter and my cooling coffee and the photograph of my mother that sits on my windowsill. The same photograph I've carried with me through every move for 20 years, her sitting on the front porch on a Sunday morning, smiling at whoever was behind the camera, looking like someone who knew something the rest of us hadn't figured out yet. I looked at her face. "Mom," I said quietly to the empty kitchen. They noticed. I called my father 3 days later. Part of me considered not telling him, not out of spite. We simply weren't close. We spoke on birthdays and major holidays, and occasionally when he called to tell me about Daniel's latest situation, a business venture that hadn't worked out, a plan that needed revising. But something made me call. I explained the invitation directly, without drama, just the facts. There was a long silence on the line. Then his voice changed, something loosened in it that I hadn't heard before. "The White House," he said. "That's right." Another pause. "Do family members attend these kinds of events?" I smiled into the phone. "Sometimes," I said. "Would there be room for?" "Yes, Dad." Over the following week, he called more than he had in the previous year combined. He had questions about Washington, the hotels, the security, the dress code, who else would be there. He was excited in the particular way of a man who had unexpectedly been invited somewhere important. I noticed, without bitterness, that his excitement was initially more about the event than about me. Some things changed slowly. I drove to Virginia the week before. The house looked smaller than I remembered. That always surprises me, the way places shrink as memory grows. My father was waiting on the porch when I pulled in. Older now. Gray had taken over completely. He moved more carefully. Time humbles everyone, eventually. We had dinner, the three of us, my father and Daniel and me, and the conversation was careful and pleasant. Daniel asked questions about my work. My father asked questions about Washington. We ate and cleared plates and sat with coffee afterward, and it was almost normal. It was almost the family we might have been. That night I stayed in my old bedroom. Most of my childhood things were long gone, but tucked in the drawer of the old nightstand was a small wooden box, and inside it, folded in the same crease lines I'd made at 17, was my mother's letter. I sat on the bed and read it one more time. Don't you ever let someone else's ceiling become your floor. I looked around the room. This room had witnessed so much disappointment, so many nights of wondering whether I would ever be enough for the people in this house to notice, so many mornings of deciding to try again anyway. The girl who had cried herself to sleep here would not recognize the woman sitting on this bed now. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, and felt something I wasn't entirely prepared for. Not triumph. Gratitude. Washington was everything it always is, history compressed into a skyline, significance built into every corner. At the hotel, my father told strangers in the lobby about the White House event. He accepted their impressed reactions with what I can only describe as parental pride, though in truth he was still mostly proud of the occasion rather than of me. When someone asked about the honoree, he sometimes mentioned my name. Sometimes he mentioned it prominently. Sometimes he described the event and let the conversation find its own shape. I found this more amusing than painful. Progress, I thought. The morning of the ceremony, I was awake before sunrise. Years of military life had rewired my internal clock permanently. I stood at the hotel window watching the city wake up, early joggers, delivery vehicles, the first commuters, Washington coming to life in the blue-gray light before dawn. A strange quiet settled in me. Not excitement, not anxiety. Completion, the particular feeling of having become the person you worked toward becoming. Whatever happened today, I had already done the real work. The White House grounds had the controlled, purposeful energy of an institution that has been at the center of history for centuries. Security checkpoints moved with quiet precision. Uniformed personnel directed guests with practiced efficiency. Everything carried weight. My father straightened his tie repeatedly in the car. We joined the line of guests moving through the registration area. Military officers in dress uniforms, government officials, community leaders, family members of honorees. The atmosphere was formal but genuinely warm, people who had earned their presence here and knew it. My father was in his element. He shook hands with people nearby, commented admiringly on the grounds, absorbed the magnitude of the setting with the enthusiasm of a man who had never expected to be in such a room. As we approached the registration desk, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced his VIP invitation. He held it in a particular way, not quite brandishing it, but not hiding it either. He glanced at me. The smile arrived on his face the way it always had, not mean-spirited, just cert. The comfortable certainty of a man who had always known where things stood, in his own estimation. "You weren't even supposed to be here," he murmured, quiet enough that only I could hear. For a fraction of a second, just a fraction, I was 12 years old, standing in the garage doorway with a perfect science project waiting. Then the fraction passed. I handed my credentials to the hostess. She scanned them. The scanner confirmed. She looked at the screen, looked at me, looked at the screen again. The color shifted in her face. She turned toward the senior Navy admiral, standing 15 feet away. "Sir," her voice was steady but soft, the way voices get when something significant is happening. "She's here." The admiral looked up immediately. He covered the distance between us in seconds. Behind him, officers who had been standing relaxed shifted into attention without being told to. A small, instinctive acknowledgement of something real. The admiral stopped in front of me, not my father, not the space between us, me, and extended his hand with a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Commander Reeves," he shook my hand firmly. "We've been waiting for you. It is genuinely an honor." "Thank you, sir," I said. "The honor is mine." He gestured toward the entrance. "Right this way." Then he turned to my father, politely, warmly, with the manner of a man who understood families and occasions. "You must be Commander Reeves's father." My father nodded, Something uncertain had moved into his expression. The admiral smiled. "You should be very proud." My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. We were escorted through the entrance and into the main building. What followed over the next 90 minutes dismantled, quietly and thoroughly, every assumption my father had arrived with. Military leaders I had worked alongside over the years greeted me by name, warmly, specifically, referencing missions and programs by detail. Not because I was famous, but because in the world where I had spent the last 20 years, I had built something real. Senior officials I had collaborated with on policy initiatives stopped to speak. A woman who ran a veterans mentorship program I had helped develop pulled me into a long hug and said the program had served 400 more people this year than last. Each conversation left my father visibly recalibrating. At one point he leaned close to my ear. "How do these people know you?" "We've worked together," I said simply. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're trying to fit a large new piece into a puzzle they thought was finished. The main ceremony hall was beautiful, flags and military banners, and rows of seating arranged with historical weight. An usher guided me to my place. Not the guest section. Not the family section. The honoree section, front row, center. My father stopped walking. "Alex," he looked at the seating arrangement, then at me. "What is this?" I looked back at him gently. "This is where they ask me to sit." The program began. Speeches were given, citations were read, accomplishments were recognized. When my name was announced, the room responded in a way that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, not the sound itself, but the texture of it. The genuine warmth of people in a room who understood the weight of what was being acknowledged. I walked to the stage. As I crossed the distance between my seat and the podium, I permitted myself one glance toward the audience. My father was not applauding politely. He was not performing appropriate enthusiasm. He was sitting very still, his hands together, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I had never once seen directed at me in 39 years. He looked like a man who had just understood something he should have known his whole life. The citation read aloud described 22 years of documented leadership, the humanitarian mission, the mentorship programs, the junior officers who had been developed under my command, the community initiatives, the public service that had continued alongside military service. Each item read like a line from a letter I hadn't known I was writing. When I returned to my seat, the admiral leaned toward me. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. I breathed through it. "I know," I said, "she always was." After the ceremony, people gathered in smaller groups throughout the hall. I spent an hour in conversation with people I respected enormously. Meaningful, substantive conversation about work that mattered. All of it felt real and earned and good. My father stayed near the back of the room. I watched him from across the space when I could. He was quiet in a way I had never seen him quiet before. Not withdrawn, processing. The particular stillness of a person turning something large over in their mind. Eventually, the hall began to thin. The admiral stopped by on his way out and shook my hand again. Then he looked at my father with a kind expression. "You raised an extraordinary person," he said. "I hope you know that." My father lowered his eyes. After the admiral left, we stood together without speaking for a long moment. Around us, the room continued its quiet conclusion, staff gathering materials, guests departing, the ceremony releasing itself into ordinary afternoon. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "I didn't know." His voice was different, smaller, honest. "What didn't you know?" I asked. He gave a short, sad sound that might have been a laugh. "Any of it. I didn't know who you were." I had rehearsed this moment in imagination dozens of times over the years. I had expected to feel vindicated, or satisfied, or angry in some complicated way. I had thought the right words would arrive fully formed, something that finally said everything I'd never been able to say. What arrived instead was exhaustion. The deep tiredness of someone who has been carrying something for too long and has finally been given permission to set it down. I know, I said softly. We walked outside together. The grounds were bathed in late afternoon light, the kind that makes even ordinary landscapes look deliberate. We walked slowly toward a garden area, neither of us directing the route, both of us just moving. Eventually, my father stopped near a bench. I owe you an apology. He said it carefully, like a man reading a sign in an unfamiliar language. Perhaps he was. I waited. He sat down, looked at the ground. When you were small, I had very fixed ideas about how things were supposed to work. He paused. I thought I understood what mattered and who was going to accomplish things, and I was wrong in ways I didn't even know to examine. A flag moved somewhere in the breeze. Distant traffic hummed. I kept waiting for Daniel to become something, and while I was doing that, he stopped, started again. I completely missed who you already were. The honest words hit harder than anything practiced could have. I remember your science project, he said suddenly. The water cycle one. I went still. The one from 3rd grade. He nodded, his eyes on the path ahead. I remember your face when you came to show me. A pause. I know what I did. Years of silence on this subject, broken here, in the most unlikely place. You remember that? I asked. I've always remembered it, he said quietly. I just never admitted it. We sat for a while. The garden held us in its quiet. Neither of us tried to fill the space. Then he said, I think your mother always knew. Knew what? That you were going to be extraordinary. He looked at the trees. She used to say it to me, not as a criticism, just as a fact. George, pay attention to that girl. Watch what she's going to do, over and over different ways. He shook his head slowly. I wasn't listening. The sound of her voice, imagined through his words, pressed against my chest. She said that to me too, I told him. She said it differently, but it was the same message. He nodded, he knew what she was like. We stood and walked again, moving slowly back toward the building's exit. Around us, the grounds were settling into late afternoon. Finally he stopped and turned toward me. His eyes were wet. Not crying, the held quality of someone controlling something with effort. I can't get those years back. No. And I can't change how I treated you. No. He swallowed hard. The next question came out carefully, quietly, like something he'd been composing for a while. But can we move forward? I looked at him. The man who had failed me, the man who had seen me standing in doorways with reports and letters and accomplishments, and found reasons to look elsewhere. The man who was, right now, genuinely asking. My mother's voice moved through me. Don't let someone else's ceiling become your floor. She hadn't said anything about holding ceilings over other people, either. I thought about what forgiveness actually means, not the greeting card version, not the pretense that damage didn't happen. The real thing. The decision to stop letting the past determine what the future looks like. Yeah, Dad, I said, we can move forward. The relief on his face was genuine and visible, and, in its own way, heartbreaking. Not because of what it revealed about the future, but because of what it revealed about all the years behind us. The flight home was nothing like the flight out. On the way to Washington, my father had talked about the event, the prestige of it, the history of the location, the other guests. On the way home, he talked about my mother. I didn't mind. More than that, I was glad. You know what I remember most about the way she looked at you? He asked somewhere over the Appalachians, staring out the window at the dark below. What? It was like she was already proud of something that hadn't happened yet. He shook his head, like she could see something the rest of us couldn't. She told me she could, I said. He turned toward me. She was right, he said, just that. Simple, direct, overdue. In the months after Washington, something changed in the texture of my relationship with my father. Not dramatically. Families don't heal in dramatic moments. They heal in the accumulated small choices to try differently, to show up, to ask questions you used to avoid, to listen when you used to wait for your turn. He began calling to ask about my work. Not the prestigious version of my work, not the public recognition, but the daily version. What challenges I was navigating, what I was proud of lately, what was hard. The first few times, I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't accustomed to the attention. Neither was he at giving it. We were both learning a language we'd never been taught. But we kept practicing. One autumn, a few months after the ceremony, he called unexpectedly. "Are you free this weekend?" I checked my schedule. "I think so. I thought maybe you'd like to visit your mother's grave with me." I sat quietly for a moment. "I'd really like that," I said. Saturday morning was clear and cool, the kind of fall day that feels deliberate. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill outside town, surrounded by old oaks that had been there longer than anyone's memory. We walked together along the path, my father and I, carrying white flowers, the same kind my mother used to plant along the front walkway every spring. We stood at her headstone without speaking for a long time. The wind moved through the leaves. Somewhere a bird was going about its ordinary life. Then my father reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something folded carefully. The official White House program, the one from the ceremony. He placed it gently against the headstone, beside the flowers. He stood looking at her name for a moment. "You were right," he said. His voice was thick but steady. "I should have listened to you." The wind moved the trees. I didn't speak. Some moments don't need anything added to them. After a while, he looked at me. "I wasted years I can't recover," he said. "I know that." "I know you know." He nodded slowly, "But I'm grateful for the years we still have." A pause. "If you are." I looked at him, this older, humbler version of the man who had carried me through so much confusion, and who was finally, now, something approaching present. "I am," I said. We stood there together for a while longer, the three of us in our way, and for the first time in my life, I felt the particular quiet of a wound beginning to close. Not disappearing, not pretending it was never there. Just closing. What I've learned, in all the years since the White House and everything before it, is this. Success does not change who you are, it reveals who you've become. I spent years believing that achievement would finally make certain people see me, that some accomplishment grand enough would rearrange the way I was perceived, and by extension, rearrange the way I felt about myself. That's not what happened. What happened was that I kept going when going was hard, for long enough that I became someone who knew her own worth without anyone else's confirmation. And from that place, from the foundation of knowing yourself, recognition, when it came, felt different than I'd imagined. Not like validation. Like evidence. Evidence of what my mother had known since, before I understood, there was anything to know. The White House ceremony was remarkable. I am genuinely grateful for it, but the real victories were smaller and earlier and quieter. The night I kept filling out scholarship applications after my father walked past and called them my only option. The first time a junior officer under my command handled a crisis with the kind of steadiness I had once had to develop in myself, and I understood that I had given them something real. The moment I realized I had stopped working to prove anything to anyone except myself. And the afternoon my father placed a White House program against my mother's headstone and said, simply, "You were right," to the woman who had seen everything clearly from the beginning. If you have spent time in this story today, perhaps you recognize something. Perhaps you have stood in a doorway holding something you were proud of, waiting for someone to turn around. Perhaps you have been the invisible one in a room full of people who share your name. Perhaps you carry a letter, or a memory, or a voice that believed in you when other voices didn't. Hold on to it. Not as a wound, not as a grievance. As a compass. The people who failed to see you do not get to determine what you're capable of. And the deepest form of forward motion isn't proving them wrong. It's building something true and real and yours, with enough grace left over to leave the door open when they finally come looking. My mother saw it all before any of it happened. My father saw it eventually, standing in the most extraordinary room of his life, watching a stranger shake his daughter's hand like she was someone worth knowing. He was right to be proud. He was just a few decades late. But we had time. And we used it. Some people who change our lives leave before we fully understand the gift they gave us. If someone believed in you when no one else did, remember them today. Carry their faith forward. And become, if you can, that person for someone else who is standing in a doorway waiting.